Good morning, folks. I just want to let everyone know we're just waiting for one more member to arrive to achieve quorum. We'll get started shortly. Should be another 5 minutes or so. Appreciate your patience. We now have quorum with the arrival of Councillor Layton. Maybe we should get started. Okay, good morning, everyone. We have quorum, and I will call the third meeting of the Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee for the 2018 to 2022 term to order. I'd just like to welcome all of our members of the committee, members of council, and members of the public and any media who may be joining us today. Thank you for taking the time to attend today's meeting. I'd like to let everyone know that the committee meetings are now being broadcast live over the internet for public view. This is new for us, so the video broadcasts are being archived and are publicly available on Toronto City Council Live YouTube channel. You are all media stars. So you can follow the agenda and the debate on your computer, tablet, or smartphone. For those of you who are interested, the URL is www.toronto.ca/council. Just to start the meeting in a good way, we're going to offer some medicines. We'll be smudging, followed by an invocation. I'm going to turn things over to the staff of the Indigenous Affairs Office to start us off in a good way. Miigwech. Good, Donald? For the prayer?
Pardon me?
Are we good for the prayer?
Can you give the prayer?
No, Larry's going to give it.
Larry's going to give it.
I just want to know when we're good to give it.
Perfect.
Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I think so.
Fantastic. Okay, I'd just like to thank Jeff and Donald for starting us in a good way, and at this point we're going to turn things over to Larry Frost for an opening invocation.
Good health. What a good health. We can't do the good stuff that we do for the people out there. But we must never forget the ones that aren't fortunate. That's why we're here. We're here to help the people who are homeless, who are on the street, who don't have food on the table. And we want to get them back on the journey as we are with housing, good food, education. So let's not forget that why we're here. And let's continue to work in unity to make it happen. So with that, I say miigwech. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. I'd also just like to remind us where we are to anchor us in the meeting for today. And, we collectively acknowledge that we are, we're meeting on land that is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. Land that is also now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Before we proceed further, I'd just like to ask if there's any declarations of interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. If so, please indicate the item number and the nature of the interest. Okay, seeing none, we will move on. May I have a motion to confirm the minutes of the Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee meeting of November 22nd, 2019? I have a motion from Councillor Layton. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. Miigwech. Okay, we can now proceed to consider the 5 items of the agenda we have before us today. I'd like to bring us to the first item, which is AA 3.1, the standing item, which is an update from the Indigenous Affairs Office. I'm going to turn things over to Jeff DeHaan from the Indigenous Affairs Consultant with the IAO, who will be providing an update to the committee. Miigwech, Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm speaking today on behalf of Selena Young, who is able to join us, but I just wanted to mention that, just because I wouldn't have this opportunity without her. So I have a few items to update folks on. So for one, I don't know if the folks on the internet will see this, but I just want to introduce the newest member of the Indigenous Affairs Office. So we now have an Indigenous Youth Research Associate in place, and this is a really unique position, and that it's a 1-year temporary contract that allows youth to enter the city positions, develop skills, develop networks, develop all kinds of things that help them serve the community and prepare them for public service. And our inaugural candidate is here. So Olivia Horzempa, this is over here. So she's awesome to work with, I will say. So it came to us from Toronto Public Health, but it's great to have her. So we now have that position, and she'll be doing a lot of policy work and all kinds of amazing supports. We've already drawn on her heavily. So welcome to the team, Olivia, on behalf of myself and Selena. Thank you. The next thing, we also have posted and will soon be interviewing for an Indigenous placemaking consultant. This position is key because sometimes folks don't necessarily understand why it's important that a community be visible. But with visibility, it becomes a sense of belonging. And there's actually research that's saying that if you don't see yourself in a community, you stop reaching out for help. So by putting things in that proclaim Toronto's Indigenous history, our Indigenous future, our resilience, all those kinds of things, we're actually making sure that our community has someone to reach out to. So this is a very key position. So there's a lot of work going to be done in this. So they'll be joining us shortly. So I just wanted to say that. So we have the candidates selected. The interviews are next week, and we'll see what happens. We also will be having a Toronto Urban Fellow joining the team in a few weeks. We have already had one. We're in fact going to hear from one later today with a presentation in partnership with the community. But we have hired another to assist with a number of initiatives. So one of those ways to promote visibility for residential school survivors is to put a sculpture and garden out in Nathan Phillips Square. That's one of the placemaking initiatives, very key, and it's being led by Toronto Council Fire. So this Toronto Urban Fellow will be assisting with that process, but also things like the Year of Public Art and other initiatives within the city to make sure that Toronto knows it's an Indigenous city, that it's no longer a secret. Then you walk in here, you remember where we came from. So that person's also coming on board. I also want to say that our draft path reconciliation will be presented to the Aboriginal Affairs Committee at our next meeting. So you'll be able to see the proposed strategic direction of the office and that kind of stuff. So that's coming very shortly, next time. Also, there will be a discussion of membership on the Aboriginal Affairs Committee. And I know just we can have a look at some vacancies, and strategy to fill them. Are there any sectors we need to engage with? So that'll also be coming down the pipe, and we'll definitely be supportive of that process. And the last thing to update is actually our National Indigenous Peoples Day celebration on June 21st. This year that falls on a Sunday, so we were wondering out loud if we could do it on Friday. We will take direction from you folks on that, but I did want to highlight that. So some of us may want to be with family on June 21st. Other of us may want to keep it on the day. We can have that discussion and move forward. And that is the update from the Indigenous Affairs Office. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hunt. Questions from the committee for staff? Most of it was an update, but I do believe there was a clear question around the National Aboriginal Day celebration regarding the sunrise ceremony and whether or not the committee thought that should happen on the Friday or the Sunday. Councillor Layton?
Yeah, sorry, if I may, it wasn't as an agenda item. Do you want some feedback now, or we could talk about it during the schedule of meetings, I suppose, but I do have a little advice, given it's also the weekend of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities in town on Friday.
Oh, interesting.
Not everyone's leaving on Sunday. There may actually be some national interest from other municipal leaders to attend.
If we do it on the Friday?
If we do it on the Friday. It's also Father's Day on the Sunday, recognizing that and it not being a work day may limit the number of people involved at the sunrise ceremony.
Okay. I think that's helpful. Thank you, Councillor Layton. Comments from others? No burning feelings about when we host the sunrise ceremony?
Can you mention those dates again? Was it a Friday? Was the original day?
The 21st falls on a Sunday this year.
Oh, okay.
And that being also Father's Day, we're hearing, and a date when folks are leaving that are coming to Toronto for this Municipal Affairs Conference. So the question is, can we do it on a Friday, which is a work day, which doesn't conflict with the Father's Day?
I have no problem with Friday myself.
Are you guys hoping to do it on Friday, Jeff?
We're open to views in the community. We do recommend Friday for the reasons Councillor Layton cited, but we're still open to feedback, but we do recommend Friday.
But I also just recommend that we have the city manager inform the folks at FCM to ask them to make it an advertised event. If people don't mind. These are municipal mayors and councillors from across Canada, and like 4,000 of them.
Wow.
We may have our biggest crowd yet. It keeps growing every year, so it might, just to give that option to people. Some of them will be waking up then anyhow if they're coming here from out east.
Given those circumstances, I think Friday makes good sense. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Chair, I just want to, I had a good comment from a fellow member. We never changed Canada Day, do we?
No.
So I guess I'm going to retract my statement perhaps and say we should keep it on June 21st as First Nations Day. Thank you.
Fair enough. Many thanks. Yes, of course, Marilyn.
Hi, good morning. I'll make a comment. I won't be available on Sunday because I'm one of those rare birds. I'll be at church on Sunday. So I would prefer the Friday, and I think for all the other reasons that Councillor Layton mentioned, I think it's more appropriate to have it when we can get the most number of people available.
Thank you. Ms. Denk?
I agree with having it on Sunday, which is the longest day of the year, and to honor the earth.
Councillor Layton?
Could we do both?
I was going to say it myself.
Like, is there something that would stop us from hosting it both days? Once as for the staff at the City of Toronto, who I know very much like to attend, but might find it difficult on the Sunday. For guests at FCM, and then another one on Sunday to mark the actual day itself. I think our staff will love this one, but could we do both, and would that be appropriate or possible?
I think we could make a recommendation to the Office of Indigenous Affairs. It may come down to capacity. I don't know if you have any commentary on that, Jeff?
So in terms of capacity, we definitely have it. We could do it both days. Because I am hearing what's in the room, and the point about candidates staying on Canada Day whenever it happens, the point about it happening on a very spiritual day, like it was chosen for June 21st for a reason. So I'm recognizing that we probably do need to stick to that protocol as that result, but recognizing we also have a unique opportunity to celebrate Indigenous people with leaders from across Canada, and we won't necessarily have that every time. It would be great to be able to seize that opportunity as well. So we can definitely do both. I think there is a strategy to that. So if folks are okay with that, that's certainly a direction we can take.
Blanche?
I would just like to comment that I agree with keeping it to June 21st, but also we could request, as Councillor Layton suggested, to have FCM included in their agenda, and if they want to attend, that's entirely up to them, but I don't believe that June 21st should be designated to alternate date. Thank you.
Thank you. Angus?
Look at that. Technology. So I wonder if it makes sense for somebody to move a motion, because it doesn't seem to me that we have broad agreement here. I mean, what I hear Blanche saying is stick with Sunday, and I think that's a position I would support for what it's worth. I hear other people saying do both. Might hear some people saying just do Friday. I don't know. So, I mean, maybe it's possible to achieve consensus here, but I'd like to be able to move on.
Councillor Layton?
So if I may, two things. My apologies. FCM was in my agenda at the wrong day. It's actually a week earlier. I just checked their website to see if Sunday was appropriate, but it doesn't matter. It's earlier in June. We would need, and on a second point, we would need an item to be introduced in order to move a motion, I suspect. But given that FCM's not going on, it would really just be the difference in the number of people that would attend that would be city staff. I'm going to come regardless. And so I'm quite happy if the consensus is keep it on Sunday, let's keep it on Sunday.
Tanya?
Also, the month of June is National Indigenous Month, so it's a celebration throughout the entire month.
Blanche?
I would just like to recognize the gentleman who brought the matter for June 21st forward. Miigwech.
Further commentary?
I would just, if we stick to the Sunday, if I could encourage the office to try to find some staff-specific event that we could do during the month, because this is typically a time when Indigenous staff and generally speaking supporters would come out and demonstrate their support. And if we could find something else that would be appropriate, perhaps it doesn't have to be at 5 8:30 in the morning. I'm quite happy for it to be a little bit later, but if that is what is deemed appropriate, then whatever staff come up with, I think would be fine.
Thank you. Pam, did you have a point?
So I just wanted to make a comment about all of the discussion, that I think it's very important for us to remember that this is Indigenous Day, and trying to accommodate outside of the purpose of the day is really, I feel like, not a lengthy discussion that we should be having. And so much to Angus's point, I think we need to make a decision and recognize and respect the importance of the day and why it is established as is.
Larry, Angus?
I agree. Let's have a motion now, because we can talk all morning. That's First Nations Day. Let's do it.
I think we can just direct staff. I don't think we have an item. I don't think we can have a motion. Yeah. So I think I'm hearing that, recognizing the importance and rationale and reason behind the 21st, that we should try to hold the sunrise ceremony to that day. I'm also hearing that June is a month of celebrations, and so there may be opportunities to do things outside of that for the City of Toronto, but in terms of the sunrise ceremony, I'm hearing let's keep that to the 21st. I'm seeing some nodding heads. Is that how we're feeling as a membership? Okay. Before we put this to rest, any further commentary on this point? Okay, so I do need a motion to receive the item of the update from the Indigenous Affairs Office by Jeff DeHunt. Okay, I see a motion made by Pam. Thank you, Pam. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. Miigwech. That brings us to the second item, AA 3.2, Justice Centres in Toronto. We have a presentation this morning from Scott McKean, who is the Manager of Community Safety Wellbeing Planning with Social Development, Finance and Administration here with the City of Toronto. Welcome.
Good morning. Excuse me. I'm just getting over a cold, so I'll try not to cough too much. Good morning, and thank you for having me this morning. My name is Scott McKean, and I'm grateful to be in front of the committee today and honored to serve Torontonians on the land and the treaty that you've acknowledged this morning, which is home to many of Indigenous people. Such treaties allow us to gather and as community, and I think it's also important to acknowledge it's currently Black History Month, and as a city staff, I have the privilege of supporting that under the treaties mentioned, and so I'm grateful to be here. Within the City of Toronto, I'm the Manager of Community Safety and Wellbeing Planning. I'm leading the development of a community safety and wellbeing plan that's legislated by the province of Ontario, which is looking at improving safety and well-being of all Torontonians. As part of my current assignment, I have the opportunity to embark on a new partnership between the city and the province of Ontario that allows me to work directly embedded in the Ministry of Attorney General for 2 days a week and work on an opportunity called Justice Centres. It allows us to work in innovative new ways between the city and the province to move forward this opportunity in the city. I do have to mention that I was going to be joined by my colleague who was at the time when we booked the meeting, Crown Attorney Michael Callahan, but at the end of last week he was actually just appointed to Justice Callahan. So Mike won't be able to join us today because his role within the project has changed. I think it's also noteworthy that it's been a significant week for the Justice Centre team because we've had another appointment out of our team, which is Jessica Wolf, who is now Justice Jessica Wolf, who will be serving in Manitoulin and as an Indigenous counsel. I think it's pretty remarkable that out of our one office, 2 of the Crown attorneys who are working on this innovative project are now justices. So today I'm here before you to talk about the collaboration with the Ministry of Attorney General and my role as a city staff in supporting the Justice Centre pilots. The pilots themselves are aiming to launch in the rough timeline of spring 2020, And it's important to note that justice centers aren't going to replace any diversion programs or specialized courts, including Gladue program. They will provide low barrier, high impact options for individuals who can benefit from this approach. In March 2019, the provincial government announced Phase 2 of the Ontario Gun and Gang Violence Reduction Strategy, which includes 4 Justice Centre pilots aimed at providing evidence-informed approaches and approaching justice from a different lens. The pilots are currently being developed in Kenora in the north, London, Ontario, the Toronto Northwest, and the Toronto Downtown East. Justice centers are operational in 70 communities around the world and move justice out of the traditional settings within courtrooms into community settings. These centers bring together the most appropriate human service providers to break the cycle of offending and improve community safety and well-being by bringing together justice and human service providers to work together and wrap around individuals. The Justice Center model improves outcomes for offenders and victims by holding individuals accountable for their offenses, but also looking at a person beyond just a charge to actually see the person and the vulnerabilities that are involved in their situation. Within Canada, Vancouver's Justice Centre has been operational since 2008. It's been very successful in increasing diversion, reducing recidivism, and increasing access to service for vulnerable individuals in Vancouver's downtown area. The Red Hook Justice Centre in Brooklyn, New York, has received a 35% reduction of the number of offenses receiving jail sentences and has reduced recidivism. Adult offenders were now 10% less likely to commit new crimes when compared to a traditional courtroom. Young offenders were 20% less likely to offend. The model has saved $4,756 per defendant, which is a total of $15 million in avoided victimization costs. The long-term vision for justice centers in Ontario is very similar to what the human service sector calls community hubs. It's by bringing justice actors and human services together to operate out of one space. This vision, like I said, is very similar to community hubs and is all about connecting human services to people and with the support of the justice system. Currently, there are 4 pilots. The Kenora Justice Centre basically is taking an Indigenous restorative justice process. Through participatory design and local community building, Indigenous leadership in Kenora Centre Advisory Council, the Ministry of Attorney General is exploring a number of pilot opportunities to reduce bail and remand populations in Kenora, enhancing post-charge diversion, providing early access to multi-sectoral supports, healing and wellness, implementing a new judicial-led pretrial court, as well as exploring enhanced assessments to support the training and mental health courts in the area. The London Community Justice Centre will also focus on young people 18 to 24 years old. Priority will be focusing in on young people who are not currently in employment, education, and training. So the pilot is actually going to look at the pre-charge space and mobilize pre-charge diversion and youth in transition for young people who are in those circumstances. This leads me to the Toronto Justice Centres. There are currently 2 pilots being proposed within the City of Toronto. The Downtown East Justice Centre will focus on adults who are 18 plus, who have a high history of recidivism. Priority will be individuals with mental health, addictions, and concurrent disorders who do not qualify or agree to attend existing specialized courts or diversion programs within the City of Toronto. They are people that are sort of reoffending at large rates in the College Park Court. The pilot will provide intensive supports and human service supports in a very timely wraparound fashion for adults who are cycling through the system. The pilot will leverage primary health care, addiction medicine, housing supports, legal aid supports, and other supports as required for individuals who are struggling with the justice system. They'll be provided case management support and have regular interface with justice staff. In the Toronto Northwest, we'll focus on a different population. We'll focus on young people who are aged 12 to 17 who are committing robberies. One of the things that we've noticed in the northwest of the city that young people in this age group are committing robberies at a higher offense than other parts or higher level than other parts of the city. It's important that we wrap around young people when they come into the court at first, and so we're proposing that there be a first appearance pilot in which young people can be connected to the most appropriate services upon entry into the system. Additionally to that, their families can also receive wraparound supports and justice education to help them navigate the court process. We're also looking at the development of a robbery pilot, which is currently being developed with stakeholders in the Northwest, which would provide specialized court services and violence escalation prevention programming for young people who are involved in the justice system in the Northwest. In terms of next steps within the City of Toronto, for the justice centers here, in the downtown east, we are currently looking for space and finalizing space. A lot of the partnerships have been negotiated, and there's been extensive consultation over the year since 2017 on this project. We hope to launch as soon as the space is secured and get it up and running. In the Toronto Northwest, this was a newly added site, and so we're still going through a participatory design process. What's noteworthy to mention is for each Justice Centre location across Ontario, there has been extensive needs assessments conducted, and the approaches have been designed with community. In terms of next steps, we hope to be operational with the pilots in the spring of 2020, but we're working towards that. The reason I'm bringing it here to the committee today is basically to provide an update. As a city staff, I wanted to make sure that this committee had information about the City of Toronto's role within the development of these justice centers, that you understand that these are new resources that will be coming to community to complement existing resources that are operational within the city, and provide any opportunity for feedback. And with that, happy to take any questions that you may have today. Thank you.
Helps if my microphone is on. Thank you, Mr. McKean. I appreciate that. Before we go to questions, I understand that we do have a deputant associated with this item, Mr. Derek Moran, and so we're going to do the deputant before we do the questions. Yeah. Okay. Okay. And just so you know, you have 5 minutes to speak. Thank you.
Are implied, and doing so is fraud. God bless Her Majesty the Queen, and long live Her Majesty the Queen. The reason I say that is because I don't want to be identified as a belligerent on the battlefield, because when you really think about it, this is a nation that is under occupation, right? We're here talking about justice, and by the way, downstairs they are conducting unconstitutional bag searches. So I just want to point out, let the record show I do not consent to the unconstitutional searches violating Section 8 of the Constitution Act 1982 that are currently taking place here at Toronto City Hall, as the province has never given the City of Toronto express statutory authority to do this. I just want to make sure that nobody loses sight of what justice actually is. Justice is defined in Black's Law Dictionary, 9th edition, as the fair and proper administration of the laws, because that's really all any of us want, right, is the government to do that, carry out the fair and proper administration of the laws. I just want to also point out that Officer Eustace at 53 Division agreed with me that it would be fraud to go around charging people with laws that didn't actually apply to them. Makes sense? So here's something about the justice system that most people don't know about. You can find this in the Courts of Justice Act. Common law and equity. Rules of law and equity, section 96.1. Courts shall administer concurrently all rules of equity and the common law. Rules of equity to prevail, section 96.2. Where a rule of equity conflicts with the rule of the common law, the rule of equity prevails. Now, Councillor Layton knows I come here all the time and I talk about this legal stuff. I got to tell you, I cannot for the life of me find out what exactly these rules of equity are anywhere. I mean, you can go on the internet and find out what the rules of civil procedure are, but the government is concealing from you what these rules of equity are. So this game called the justice system, in their own act, it says these rules prevail. If you got dragged into one of their courts, however, and to play their game, does it seem fair to any of you that you have to play this game not knowing what the rules are because they haven't provided them to you? So that's one thing that I was hoping that the Crown Attorney that was here today one of you could possibly ask him, where can we find what these rules of equity are? So I was arrested, well, not me, but the person I have was arrested a year ago at the Toronto Public Library. And when I went to Old City Hall, I pointed out to Justice of the Peace Marilyn Turley on the wall that, the coat of arms there, it says in French, Dieu et mon droit. That's French. In English, it stands for God and my right. So remember, the first line of the Constitution we have does say recognizing the supremacy of God. So you'll find in Psalms 98:9, it says, before the Lord, for he cometh to judge the earth. With righteousness shall he judge the world and the people with equity. Again, the rules of equity that nobody can find if you're ever dragged into one of these courts that you can use for yourself. So it's not every day, again, that you have a Crown Attorney, but he's not here today, show up at City Hall. I was going to remind him of Mercer versus Ontario, Attorney General for Ontario. Supreme Court of Canada said, the sovereign chosen by society. I don't know about that. I don't think we really chose the sovereign chose us. The sovereign chosen by society holds the land in trust for the people. Wow, who knew about that, right? As a fide comma sum. That's a fancy Latin law term, that trust law term. Except nobody knows about this case because it's from 1881, and it's the only case this mentions it. So people are probably wondering, whoa, what is this trust this guy's talking about? If Craig could be so kind to put that on the feed there so people at home could notice this. I went on this website called Dun & Bradstreet. Up at the top here, I don't know how clear that is, I punched in as the company name, Canada, the state, District of Columbia, the country, the United States, and what popped up is something called the In God We Trust /USA Inc. So In God We Trust would probably be the legal name of the trust, and USA Inc. would probably be the operating as name. Do you know that when I took a screenshot of this and I posted it on Facebook, I went back and I tried to duplicate this again on Dun & Bradstreet. They deleted that after I posted that on Facebook. So remember that. We are all part of the In God We Trust. And I just want to point out that a lady, an unrepresented lady at Old Osgood Hall was very frantic because the bank had stolen her condo a while ago. And Justice Paul Rouleau from the Court of Appeal said to her, I may be giving away too much information as it is, but unless you give me the power, there's nothing I can do to help you. What he was really saying that if you ever get dragged into these courts, you have to appoint the judge to act as trustee for you, because this is all about trust law, and they're all using trust law against us in these courts.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee? No? Appreciate it.
And you have to execute the trust.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moran. Okay, I'll invite Mr. McKean back to the podium there for any questions from the committee regarding the presentation on justice centers in Toronto.
Just
Mr. Frost?
Just a question on how the the justice system in Toronto, how are these people involved, educated as far as the Indigenous culture training? Like, are they taking that, or are they taking it, or it's just?
Do you mean the actual justice staff, like
Yeah.
crowns, judges?
Yeah.
There's processes within the Ministry of Attorney General. There's Indigenous Justice Division that would oversee that work.
Yeah. So you're saying yes?
I was saying I can't answer for the Ministry of Attorney General, but as a city staff, it's my understanding in the work I've been doing that there's the Indigenous Justice Division that would lead that work.
Okay, thank you.
However, if, as a city staff embedded in a provincial ministry, if you have recommendations, I'm happy to take them back to the ministry.
Well, I would recommend that they take the Indigenous culture training, awareness training, yes. Thank you.
I do have one question myself, because you referenced the case in Vancouver, which is an interesting justice center. I happen to be a displaced Vancouverite myself. In Vancouver and in BC, they also have some specific First Nations courts, which are separate and distinct from the justice centers and are engaged in therapeutic jurisprudence from an Indigenous perspective. I'm just wondering, because we see such an overrepresentation of Indigenous youth and adults in the justice system, are these centers envisioning specific portions of them that are exclusively focused on supporting Indigenous folks, or sort of what's happening around Indigenous programming in these justice centers?
So within the Kenora model, it's solely Indigenous focused. From a Toronto perspective, there's already great leadership in that space, and we would take advice from those bodies. And so recently, in a consultation with the Toronto Aboriginal Social Services Council, it was very clear that those bodies exist, and that we should be not trying to replace them, but we should be trying to look at where we can best support those processes as well as be inspired by them. So I think I think we're well taken care of in Toronto, and if there's more work to do, again, that's advice that we can take to the ministry as the City of Toronto.
Thank you. Pam. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, so what are the consultation bodies that you would have used in consultation for Indigenous-focused
So
centers?
in terms of across the province or within the City of Toronto?
In the city.
Within the City of Toronto, in the back, there are some appendices that you can see that outline who the ministry consulted. So in 2017, the ministry was out consulting a number of bodies. There's a full list here in terms of Indigenous service organizations, the Provincial Aboriginal Service Advisory Council, Anishinaabe Health, Native Women's Resource Center, Aboriginal Clinic actually attended some of the consultations that happened. In addition to that, just as recent as last week, the Toronto Aboriginal Social Service Council was consulted.
Okay. Can I keep going? Can you highlight what the specifics are for the Indigenous community in Toronto? Because I'm not quite grasping. We're going to have centers. I understand Kenora has an Indigenous focus, but where is the Indigenous focus for the City of Toronto?
So within the City of Toronto, and particularly in the Downtown East pilot, we did not take an Indigenous focus because there are existing Indigenous mechanisms such as Gladue Court and some of the work that's happening in terms of restorative processes.
Okay.
The reason I'm bringing this to your attention is there will likely be alignment that needs to happen with those sort of processes. So it's important for me to let you know that the Downtown East Justice Center, which will probably have the most interface, will not replace existing mechanisms like Gladue, but rather complement their work.
Okay. So I have two more questions, if that's okay.
Go ahead, Pam.
So one, the funding that is being put in place for all of these centers, will there be similar funding for Indigenous-specific justice centers?
So in Kenora, right now, there is funding for that Indigenous-specific center. So what's important to mention is that the long-term vision is to have a fully scaled justice center model, but right now we're developing 4 pilots across the province. My role is to support the 2 within Toronto. The learning that happens across those 4 pilots will advise the future steps. So the opportunity for funding allocation and/or engagement around a longer term or additional processes within the City of Toronto will happen as a result of the what we learn from all 4 pilots.
All right.
Just as a follow-up to that, because there's 4 pilots, one of them is Indigenous, and that Indigenous pilot is in Kenora. So we don't really have a large-scale urban Indigenous pilot where the context and needs and realities of justice are quite different than they are in Kenora, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Blanche, did you have a question?
Yes, I just have one question. It's in regards to the Northwest pilot. Excuse me. You mentioned that there were high rates of robbery. I'm presuming that your study unveiled why?
Yes.
Okay. Could you give us an example? Is it poverty? Is it homeless? What?
Yeah, there are a number of factors, but they all revolve around poverty and the social determinants of health.
Andrea.
Good morning, Michael. Yes?
Scott.
Okay, good morning, Scott.
Good morning.
I'm Andrea with Toronto Council Fire, and it's interesting, the pilot that you have downtown East Side, and I'm just going to build on Pamela's comments. The area downtown East Side has 13 agencies, and I find it really difficult to understand why we weren't taken into consideration that there should be a separate, in addition to the Gladue. You know, they're overpopulated with the issues that they're dealing with right now. But a number of the persons who are from Kenora, as well as other communities within this region, have migrated to Toronto. And so the population that we have, it's really critical. And just so you know, and we'll speak to this a little later, that Toronto Council Fire is initiating our own safety, our community safety and well-being process, which will also be taken into account the justice process that we require, not just for our community, but the community at large, because it's up to us to reach out to those neighbors who are of a different society, because they also experience, you know, robberies, and it's not just poverty. There's human trafficking. There's a number of other areas that we have too as well. So I'd like to have some revisiting of that justice center that you're saying is going to complement the Gladue Court, which is overwrought with work right now. And again, just to remind you that we have 13 service providers in that downtown area, and even trying to address the issues that we deal with is very difficult. Now,
So thank you for your comments and for the work of Council Fire and the 13 organizations that you talked about. I think there's a couple of opportunities ahead in fleshing this out. So the community justice centers I'm here to speak to you today about, which is part of the Ministry of Attorney General's mandate. I, as a city staff, am supporting that work, and we can look, again, based on what's learned across the 4 pilot sites, this is an opportunity to look forward to how the ministry can invest in justice within the City of Toronto. In addition to that opportunity, the other piece of my work, which is a City of Toronto Council mandated piece of work that is also provincially legislated, is to develop a community safety and well-being plan for the city that takes into fact some of the issues that you just actually articulated. And we're actually just getting going with that work. And so what I would like to do is to, I was at task last week talking about some of our thinking around the community safety and well-being plan. I definitely would like to connect with you and the other 13 organizations that you mentioned, as well as others across the city, to talk about what community safety and well-being means beyond just justice, because to your point, community justice is an element that'll be embedded in our plan, but there's also other vulnerabilities. You mentioned human trafficking and other pieces. We're really interested in looking at, how as a city can we better sort of mobilize in the spaces of risk intervention, but more importantly in the spaces of prevention and ongoing social development, getting to the roots, similar to what your colleague here mentioned earlier, to really address these things. So there's an opportunity for us as a city to think that through, and I definitely need to work with you to be able to do that.
Please continue. Yeah.
Thank you. And just to respond to that, what we found that we had to do is not rely on the province or the City of Toronto, that we had to reach out. The project that we're doing is Southern Ontario, and we're reaching out to other urban sites to see what they have and how can we build a safety net, because so many of these our urban centers do not have the same. So how do we collaborate as well? With Toronto, there's a video, and it's a shame that I didn't initiate that, but there's a video on the trafficking that's really, really strong in this particular city, and you can't leave that to the Gladue courts. You really have to make sure that these justice centers are working with with the agencies that deal directly with our community members. So it is critical. I was at the task, and either I was asleep, but I don't remember seeing you there or presenting. So, no.
It happened last week there was a special day, I guess, put together by the Toronto Aboriginal Social
Were you
Service
asleep as
Councils
well, I guess?
around city staff.
I don't think it was a regular council meeting. I think it was a special meeting that was established through task for, yeah.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions or comments from the committee? Okay. Seeing none, do I have a motion to accept the report? Angus, thank you. All in favor? Any opposed? Seeing none, the motion carries. Thank you very much. Okay, that brings us to the third item, which is AA 3.3, the City of Toronto's response to the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. We have Lauren Kimura, who is an Urban Fellow with the Indigenous Affairs Office from the City of Toronto, along with Mandy Wesley, a consultant. They're here to provide a presentation to the committee. Welcome, and miigwech.
Hello. This one? Good morning, everybody. My name is Lauren Kimura, and I just want to take a moment to introduce myself to the committee. I'm a settler of mixed race Japanese European heritage, and I'm originally from Vancouver. Grew up on unceded Coast Salish territory, but I've been grateful to live and work here in Toronto for the past 4 years. And within the Indigenous Affairs Office, I've been helping to coordinate this work, but I just also want to introduce and express my gratitude to have a co-presenter, Mandy Wesley, here today with me. So,
Bonjour, Wache. It's so nice to see new faces and faces that I've long since been familiar with. My name is Mandy Wesley, as Lauren has indicated. I'm also known as Sky Dancer. And I'm still in the process of learning all that entails, all the roles and responsibilities. But part of it that I've learned to date is to give voice to those who normally haven't had a voice, is to be a helper. And by profession, I am a lawyer. I am, first and foremost, I am a First Nations woman. I am a mother. I am the daughter of a survivor. I have two beautiful, beautiful Cree girls and a wonderful husband who always stands beside me. And so I am really grateful to be here today to continue on with that work and helping to give voice to those that sometimes don't always have a voice that's heard. So with that, I will be speaking on later about what we heard when we gathered together with Indigenous community members, Indigenous service providers on the issue of advancing the calls for justice that came out of the final report of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, Reclaiming Power in Place. And so with that, I'll hand it back over to my colleague and co-presenter, Lauren.
Thank you, Mandy. I also just want to start by acknowledging that the women and the families and the communities who have been relentless in doing this work, especially when governments failed to respond or even acknowledge the continuous disappearance of Indigenous women and girls. Without their work, we really wouldn't be here today discussing how the city should be responding. I just want to thank them for their continuous guidance, as well as the community organizations doing this work. Want to thank them for the continuous guidance they've provided to show the city and help us guide us on a path forward. So miigwech for that. Okay. So as many of us know, on June 3rd last year, the final report from the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls was released. From that report, 231 individual calls for justice were forwarded, and they were directed at governments, institutions, social service providers, industries, and at all Canadians. Very shortly after, City Council forwarded a motion that we consult on the role and responsibilities of the municipal government in responding to the calls for justice, and that we report back to this committee by the first quarter of 2020. So that brings us to today. Here we are. We are providing an update. We're providing an update on the progress that we've made so far, some of the actions that we've taken to better understand what the city's role is in this work. And so as Mandy mentioned, we're going to be touching on some of those pieces, sharing what we heard from the community, sharing what we've heard so far from city staff. But largely, we are here at this committee asking for your input on what the next steps should be, because I think we can all acknowledge that this work it's going to be an ongoing effort, and it's going to be a sustained commitment from the city. And this has been a relatively short time to really fulsomely understand what the city should be doing. So we really want to have the guidance of the community and these voices to ensure that we're moving forward towards actions in an appropriate way. So quickly, I'm just going to touch on some of the pieces that we've done. Basically, starting last fall, we began to analyze the calls for justice and look at which ones could be within the city's purview and which ones might be outside of the city's jurisdiction. And out of the 231 calls, we identified approximately a little over 100 are relevant in some way to city action. The extent to which the city is already responding to some of those calls, we've also summarized through different methods, including interviews with various staff and an internal survey. And so we've also been able to identify some opportunities of ongoing work that's happening right now that can be enhanced to better address the calls for justice. Also last fall, pretty early in our planning and thinking around this project, we went to introduce the work to task and asked organizations there in what way they wanted to be engaged with the work. And from that meeting, a few key organizations, including Council Fire and Native Women's Resource Center, had kind of stepped forward to participate in a community conversation. And we saw that as an opportunity to have an initial conversation with the community. So it was, I think we we had the understanding that there would probably be further engagement happening. But at that point, at the recommendation of the community, we had hired Mandy Wesley to come on and shape that session, along with Elder Wanda Whitebird. So I think she'll probably speak to that a little bit more. But yeah, so in November and December, some of that planning took place to shape what that conversation would look like. And then we also consulted interdivisionally, internally with some staff to hear from them. So I'll pass it to Mandy, and she can share some thoughts about the engagement.
Miigwech, Lauren. So in my left hand, you might have noticed I'm holding something. So many of you recognize what that is. It's a tobacco tie. This is one of our many sacred medicines. And part of our protocols, as you've been introduced to and you probably know, is that when you're asking someone to do something in a good way, in a kind way, you present them with tobacco. And tobacco, it carries our prayers, and oftentimes we will place it on the ground and return it to the Creator. So in accordance with protocol, Lauren did this today when she asked me to come and speak, and we also did this with Elder Wanda Whitebird. And Elder Whitebird accepted that, and so in leading up to the actual engagement session, we had multiple meetings. We talked about what that could look like, what it would involve. And in order to have a fulsome discussion, we knew two things were required. One, a safe space. We knew that we had to create a safe space where community members and service providers could come and speak openly and freely. And two, we needed to do some preparation because we were pressed for time, but we did it. This was between, I think, in a matter of 4 weeks. So during those 4 weeks leading up, this was over the Christmas holidays too, we reached out to community service providers such as Council Fire to ensure that there would be health supports in place, that there would be medicines, that there would be counselors available on hand if need be. Because the task at hand involved talking about personal experiences. This is the impact, people talking, being the most vulnerable. So we created that safe space, and also we wanted to make sure that people would be respectful of one another's time and voice. And so I collected grandfathers, little grandfathers, the day before, actually from the City of Toronto. I don't know if your cameras caught me doing that. But I thought it was important to have that linkage, that connection to the City of Toronto, because the city was actually asking the community, how can we work together? So it's important to have that connection there. And the grandfathers, each person who was speaking held them. And so when they had that grandfather, that stone in their hand, they initially had the floor. So that's how we ensured that. Part of the discussion was a large group discussion, and then we broke off into small groups. But going back to the planning part, so there was 4 questions that were provided, or 4 areas of questions that were provided in advance. And you'll see this in the draft final report. And they focused on looking at where are we now? What kind of supports and services are we providing for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited persons who are affected family members and survivors of violence? And we talked about critically, constructive critically. How are we doing that? Are we doing a good job? Where are the gaps? We also identified in terms of proactive change. And the community and City of Toronto, in doing so, this very action is, how do we build a safe and inclusive community where Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited persons are not targeted for acts of violence? And it's not lost on me the fact that as I sit here today, that we're talking about, I'm hearing things like community safety and well-being in the matters that came before. I'm hearing things about poverty and social determinants of health. And creating safe space, creating space. And I'm referring to the matters that were heard before this current matter, before this honorable committee. And it's because when we talk about this, it's all interconnected. It's all related. And when we view it through the lens of Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited persons, we know that we, and I say we because I am one of them, and I'm the mother of 2 of them, that we are the most vulnerable. We are the most marginalized. And at the same time, we have that power and that strength within us. So how do we actually respectfully create that space where that sacredness is honored? And so that was part of our discussion, was we really want to make a safe and inclusive community in Toronto. We also talked about responsive change. in terms of first responders, emergency services. These are the men and women who are first on the scene. And I asked, and this was through the guidance of Elder Wanda Whitebird, I asked people to put themselves in the position, and for many it wasn't a stretch because they had been there. What would you do, what would you want from emergency services, those first responders, and thereafter? What would you expect as an affected family member or a survivor of violence? The last question was looking forward, and it was talking about ongoing supports, because we know that the journey for healing, it's not a straight line, and it's ongoing, it's continuous. It doesn't fit into any fiscal calendar year. It can take a lifetime, oftentimes it does. So those were the questions that were put to the small groups, or sorry, to the group in advance. And we had approximately, I believe it was 30 participants. And the participants, we realized actually when we were actually in the middle of the discussion, many of them themselves were affected family members. We had much more than we had actually anticipated. However, we were able to support those that were actually needed those supports on hand because they were readily available and rose to the occasion. So miigwech, Yahweh. So what did we hear? We did hear that Toronto is the best city for services. And I'm proud of that. And I know it to be true because I've lived here for so long and I've been part of those frontline service deliveries. And nowhere in Canada are there as many direct Indigenous-led, Indigenous-delivered services for Indigenous peoples. So there are a lot of existing services. There's over 50 specific Indigenous service providers in Toronto alone. Beyond that, we also heard that there are specific liaisons within mainstream service providers, including policing. There is a liaison office there, as well as other offices throughout, different sectors, such as health. We also know that Toronto is an epicenter. It's an epicenter of so many, we have events, we have conferences here. We heard about, the municipalities gathering here. It's a hub. It's a hub of gathering. It's a gathering place. And we know that traditionally it's always been a gathering place, and it continues to be very much. One of the services that we heard a great deal about was the Family Information Liaison Unit. And this is actually housed within the Ministry of Attorney General. It's a federally funded program. They work with individuals to help find information about their loved ones that are missing or murdered. We heard great things about that. So when we talk about the services that are going on in Toronto, the network is much larger than that. As we've heard before, our people are mobile. They come from all over. And as well, there has to be a non-siloed approach where we have multiple offices, multiple communities working together. Speaking of which, a non-silo approach, we also heard that to look at and work with the community to support in a holistic, wraparound manner. To their credit, Native Child and Family Services is actually looking at a healing lodge. And their approach is actually to support Indigenous women right straight across the spectrum of healing. So working with individuals that are coping with trauma through way of substance abuse, addictions, and also to actually help with counseling, whether it be traditional ways or it be mainstream westernized ways, but also life skills. So to help along with the trauma, but also build life skills so individuals are able to fully participate in society. We also learned when we get back to it is that we need to learn how to be kind to one another. Because collectively, we are dealing with trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma. And many of those that are working in these frontline programs, we bring our own trauma. We have our own trauma. And through the guidance and grace of the Creator, we've been able to actually work on that trauma. But those are the persons that are drawn to do this work, to help others. And so we need to take care of them too. That was something we talked about. So the flip side of that is, so we know what we're doing, But how are we able to do it? A big issue is the lack of consistent funding, long-term, and I talked about healing being a long-term journey. And many of the community organizations, they're doing this work off the corner of their desk because they recognize the need. It has to be done, and yet they're working with the resources, the limited resources they have, and they've been creative with that. But you can only do that for so long. You can only be stretched thin for so long. And it's a disservice to the community because the community deserves our best. So how can we better serve the community? Well, one of the issues that was highlighted was substantive equality. And that was brought forward by a community member, and she was talking about, and this is an individual, Krista Bigcanoe, who actually worked with the National Inquiry as lead counsel. And she talked about that almost all of the calls for justice require appropriate and adequate funding. And these are basic human rights. And that's what we are. We're talking about your basic fundamental human rights not being met. And then when we view it through an Indigenous lens, we're also talking about Aboriginal rights and gender-based rights are not being met. So there isn't not a level of substantive equality that Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited persons are experiencing. So what does that mean? That means that you cannot apply a cookie-cutter approach where you're providing the same services to two different individuals and expect the same outcome. It has to be tailored to the individuals. This requires long-term commitment consistently in service providing. We also heard that there's more harm being caused. We heard that the Aboriginal Peacekeeping Unit, when it was once created, there was 5 participant dedicated officers to servicing the Indigenous community in Toronto, and this is going back to 1992. However, we've heard that it's been cut significantly. Initially, it was decreased by 70%, leaving it to 2 officers dedicated to specifically working with and on behalf of Indigenous community people. Now we're down to one person, and I'm going to use a direct quote here, and this is from former Aboriginal Peacekeeping Unit member Kim Turner, and she said, "The APU has changed. It's a ragged structure with a white man process. They need to increase their staff so there's someone on the other end when you call that can actually intervene before escalation. Biases in humans is the biggest problem." So what Kimberly identified is that, again, this goes back to kindness and properly resource services and actually working with people and seeing them as human beings and treat them with dignity and respect. Kimberly's comments were echoed from other community members. During the course of our discussion, it came forward that a mother had to advocate on herself and basically argue with the police when she was searching for her lost child. These are things that shouldn't happen. There was other incidents that were brought forward to Emily Hill, who's a lawyer who advocates on behalf of Indigenous clients day in, day out. Her experience has collectively been that when they are actually bringing the concerns to police in Toronto, that they're hearing that they're not treated with the same level of respect and care as other people. They will hone in and look at, blame victim. Victim blaming is what it actually is. It's actually looking, does this person use substances? Are they a street worker? Are they involved in the sex trade industry and that? So in terms of, there needs to be proper education and training, and it has to be anti-racist and regarding bias. When we talk about this epidemic of Indigenous women and girls, and if you get to the heart of it, what's at the center of it is racism. And for women and two-spirited persons, it's intersectional discrimination on the basis of race, on the basis of gender, on the basis of identity. And it permeates all sectors. Everything from our laws to government policy, to the services that are provided. So how do we address this? Well, in terms of delivering and offering and mandating and requiring education and training, it has to be delivered in a way that it actually brings forth the perspective of Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited persons. So it has to be through that lens and through that delivery. And when people are educated, and I'm thinking in a larger scale, when we talk about education and actually education of children, because that's how we learn. This is learned behavior. We all know that nobody's born to hate. Nobody is born in this life to be racist. A lot of people, they are unaware of their biases. So there's a lot of unlearning that has to happen, and there's a lot of relearning and respect and kindness that has to happen before we can get towards healing and working towards reconciliation. And for Indigenous people, part of that healing is access to lands. There was an acknowledgement of the territories here. And for us, there is a strong healing connection of all Indigenous peoples across the globe, that connection to land. And creating safe space. So what could Toronto do? This was discussed in terms of creating safe space and access to parks and lands so that ceremonies could be conducted, as well as utilizing the space that you have to actually allow for events or ceremonies to take place. One individual talked about how great it felt when, I believe it was the city of Edmonton, actually allowed an elders conference to be held within one of their facilities. This is something that could be done, and of no charge. And they felt respected and taken care of. That's a good way to move forward in terms of building that relationship and that trust. Another thing we heard about was, as part of creating that safe space too, is to utilize the services that you already have. There was talk about doing a Toronto 311 type of service that would be Indigenous specific. There was also talking about the City of Toronto using the existing tools, like your ability to advertise your poster, whether it be like the transit system or bus stops or that, or have posters within there that would actually educate and inform people about the epidemic of MMIWG. So at the end of this gathering, actually even before that I'll say this, the community really comes together and takes care of one another. During our time that day, there was a family mother, and she was moved to tears. She became overwhelmed with the emotion of everything that we were talking about. And in an instant, the community rose up, they gathered their drums, they surrounded her, and they sang the Strong Woman song. So right there, that action alone, that is love, that is ceremony, that is taking care of one another. And that's what needs to happen more. And how it can happen more and how Toronto can help facilitate that is to create opportunities for that to happen. Because one of the things we did hear was that a lot of the people, when they gathered, they're like, wow, we haven't done this. I didn't know that, this organization provided that. I didn't know that, you guys were doing that frontline services with human trafficking survivors and that. There was a lot of discussion. And it goes back to what I said, where a lot of the community services are stretched thin. And they're doing these funding applications, and they're rigid, and they're demanding. And that was the other thing. Community organizations want the autonomy because we know what's best, because we are the community. So they need long-term sustainable funding and the autonomy on how to deliver those. Because oftentimes the funding comes with so many strings attached. And as someone who has worked inside of government, I recognize that. And I recognize the need for accountability and transparency, but there are other ways to do things. There was a reference from the previous presenter, Scott, he was talking about the Indigenous Justice Division. I worked there from the onset, and I know that they do things differently. So there are ways to change and move outside of these rigid boxes. So, where do we go from here? Well, the community has laid out different recommendations for the City of Toronto to consider. So what I did was I compiled them, and these are based on their voices and what was said at that meeting. And like Lauren said, it's the first in a series of gatherings, I want to say, because like any relationship, it's ongoing. It can't be a one-off. There has to be, and there will be things that will change. But right now, what you have before you for action are various recommendations on how we could move forward. And so with that, I'll hand it back over to Lauren.
Thank you, Mandy. I just want to briefly touch on some of the things that we heard from staff as well. But I think, as Mandy's expressed, that the engagement with community was really meaningful, and I think we see that as, at least personally, I saw that as a very good start to this relationship building, and something that we can move forward in a good way. But basically from staff, I'll just share really quickly that some of the core themes that we've been hearing just directly align with what the community has been saying. So again, long-term and adequate funding, anti-racism education and training for staff, finding ways to access land and ceremony, and having opportunities for real and meaningful participation. Were themes that were found from staff as well. And staff also were able to offer very specific recommendations, which have been summarized in one of the appendices. So I won't go into that too much right now, but some of the, there are many, I guess, ongoing pieces of work in progress across lots of city divisions. A lot of our work has kind of just been coordinating and understanding everything that's going on right now. And so I think we're at a very good time to have gathered all that input from across city divisions. We've also heard from the community, and now we can kind of move forward to shaping some solid recommendations. So I'm just gonna touch on what's next, and then we'd really like to hear from you and your comments for how to move forward. But within the next couple of months, we're looking to have feedback from this committee. We're looking to report back to the community with the engagement report to provide more opportunities for input. We're also likely going to be consulting more broadly with individual organizations as it makes sense. And like I said, moving to work with the leadership of key divisions who have work ongoing right now to identify what immediate enhancements that it can make to better address the experiences of Indigenous women and girls and 2S people. As Jeff mentioned, we're hoping to have the staff, or the path to reconciliation coming back to this committee at the next meeting. And one thing that we could be doing is actually embedding the recommendations from missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls actually into the path to reconciliation, so that can all come together. That's a suggestion. It could be strategic in that there's a long-term mandate and commitment of that strategic plan, and it'll also ensure that there's some alignment with the rest of the priorities of the Indigenous Affairs Office. And yeah, so thank you from both of us. Really appreciate, and we're really grateful for having the opportunity to share some of the things that we've been up to today. And specifically, we'd also just like to, one thing that we're looking on feedback about is in what way this committee sees the ongoing work, sees the implementation and the further development of these recommendations. How should that be overseen? So if that is through a specific task force for MMIWG, or if it's through this committee, we're really curious to hear from you. So thank you, Miigwech.
Thank you, Ms. Kimura and Ms. Wesley. I appreciate that. I'd just like to turn things over to the committee now to ask if there's any questions regarding this item. Andrea?
Trying to give everybody a chance. And so I think the first thing I want to do is I want to acknowledge Kirsten Wong-Tam and Michael Layton for advancing this motion, because it is important to acknowledge our colleagues from the city for their foresight and wanting to put something in place, but it's just as important that it's the implementation. This process, Council Fire participated along with members of our board in their different capacities with other agencies. And we heard firsthand the experiences that each of them go through. We're not looking to wait for a report to come through. From that particular time, we looked at what's our responsibility. Yes, there's the issue around dollars. Yes, there's all of the above that Mandy and Lauren have identified. But what we did was, what can we do immediately in terms of our particular area, which has 13 agencies in. So the first thing that we talked about is establishing a forum which is a community safety and well-being event that we will be hosting for our friends of Regent Park, and that's also the neighborhood, to ensure that we're working collaboratively. I think it's not just about the Indigenous populations, it's about our relationships that we have with one another. So we're looking to exchange and how can we hit the streets to ensure that we're implementing a safety plan, a community watch, and a number of other things. The report was shared with our board, and this past weekend we talked about the report, but also some of the recommendations. And one of the recommendations that I did have a chance to speak to Mandy prior to her taking on a position with the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory was to tell her very clearly, for us, what we're looking for is we're looking for a permanent calls to justice office. And that office will be entrusted to implement these initiatives. They're again identifying the four areas that were addressed, and it would be staffed. It would be housed and by our own, for our own, but working in collaboration with the City of Toronto. We looked at what can we do in terms of Toronto Council Fire itself. How do we make, what is a safe place? What does that mean to us? What does it mean to our neighborhood? And how do we reach out? So we implemented immediately areas that we can make some changes within our own operations, but also how do we start ensuring that we're extending our safety and security to our neighbors like Anishinaabe homes, because there's a lot of issues that are happening there. Again, they're riddled by whether it's the drug trade, whether it's the human trafficking. But because of the neighborhood that we have, we can collaborate. We can collaborate and looking at developing a peacekeeping force that's similar to the Bear Clan patrol that's in Winnipeg. We're looking to bring them out. And also not to hire them, but to see what worked for them and what is a responsibility of our community. So I think the immediate thing that was passed at our motion, at our table at the board was to implement, to support and advance a permanent calls to justice office, and I'll share this with the chair too as well, to ensure that the implementation needs to be staffed by our own, for our own. And that's one of the areas. The other area that they identified and through the discussions was something, and again, we're very respectful of the jurisdiction that I refer to, the jurisdiction of the Native Women's Resource Center area for Allen Gardens, who we have a great regard for, and our elder works in collaboration with 51 Division to ensure that we're doing the walkabout to work and extend that good handout to not only our people, but those who are on the streets, ensuring that there's an education process that redirects them back to the various service agencies, not just our own, but others that are open to assist them. The one area was the removal and looking at how do we create these permanent places like Allen Gardens to ensure that we can hold ceremonial on an ongoing basis, that we don't have to run up against the Toronto Police Services. We have good relationship with 51 Division, but that's not the same. There needs to be an education process too as well. The most recent one, it's interesting, is that our community love to get together. They love to get together, whether it's through a powwow, whether it's through social. And most recently, Council Fire is sitting on this committee called ICE. And it's Indigenous Center for Innovation Entrepreneurship. And this particular building is going to be on the corner of Dundas and Jarvis. And so we see that site as ours, as within our neighborhood, that we will activate our community to ensure that we are assuming that space. I was really quite impressed by this community for standing up and standing alongside with our members across the country for our colleagues within BC on the Trans-Canada pipeline. And I believe that that's the same thing. You'll see our community also mobilize very quickly to take back what is ours, and to ensure that we're placing it in a really good place. We're also inviting the opportunity for business persons, but business persons who also need to get some cultural training and understand about our community, who our community is, and how you can help and contribute before you're taking a space at all. So we look at our partnerships that we have within our neighborhood, as I say, with Daniel Spectrums. Daniel Spectrum, we're looking to have that replaced so we can also utilize the ICIE facility for how do we contribute back to a facility that can give back to our community, and that can also bring our families together in a downtown core. I did share at that time in pro World War II, a lot of our families migrated to Toronto, and for a number of reasons. And some of them was also including the residential school process. They gravitated and they moved to Regent Park, which was the first social housing across Canada. It was very accommodating because of the sizes. And in 2003, there was a revitalization, which was really displacing a number of our families. A lot of them want to have maintained. There's very little housing that is left that's available to them. We want to ensure it's, and then we find a number of our extended families coming from across Canada who find or assume there's a really good place that they can have a safe home, they can have jobs when they come into this particular city, and that's not the case. That's not the case. I work with seniors. I work with seniors who are still on the streets and looking for housing, safe housing. And so I think it's really important that this permanent office calls to justice office, and I agree. It should be coupled with the recommendations from the TRC. We don't want to talk about reconciliation. It's really not about reconciliation. It's about restitution. Reconciliation for the other party is restitution for making things right, and I think that's incumbent upon our community. So there are a number of areas that we have identified within our resolution that we will be advancing for consideration and implementation to ensure that we're getting this particular office up and running, and that we'll do it right. We'll do it right from the onset. We don't have to have collision courses with any other offices that we have created, and we want to make sure that things are working for all of us, not just for one particular group. So I say, Yamako, for listening and having this opportunity. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrea. Any other questions or comments from the committee? Pam. Yes.
So I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge Andrea and Council Fire and both of you wonderful individuals who did hold the consultation, which was a wonderful experience and very productive. I think it's important to acknowledge that every time we talk about this matter and many matters of the community, it's re-traumatizing for people. And so frankly, I'm getting just tired. And so for me, I think that the work was done. It was done in a good way, and the recommendations have been brought forward for the city. And so I would like to see action in return and some sort of report back on how they're going to be answered or addressed, and in what sort of timeline we can expect, because this issue has been going on for decades. And the more we talk about it, the more we're creating awareness, which I appreciate, but we spoke a lot during the consultation about action, and if we don't make moves soon, more women go missing and more women are being murdered. And so I just want to acknowledge that there's significance and importance to everything said here today, but I do think that we have done our part. We continue to do the work. We'll always do the work as community members and service providers. But there is a collaboration to this meeting and to the whole consultation, and part of the responsibility falls into the hands of others. And so I look forward to some sort of plan or report back on how we can put things into action.
Thank you, Pam. Others? Councillor Layton.
Yes, thank you very much. And first I'll acknowledge, like, I'm sitting here as the city councillor appointed member, not of the community, but as a supporter. I'm also a white male from relative privilege. To the substance of delivery of programs in this regard, it's not my area of expertise or personal understanding. I will say, though, that in relation to how decisions are made in this building, I think that I could give some advice to the staff in navigating this. It might not come as a surprise that, so we sit budget committees in this room. We sat for 15 days in the last month and a half. And we have, it's packed. There are staff members bursting out the doors. Every division's in here. We're asking them questions. And those questions are trying to get to a fundamental point as to what are our priorities as a city? Where should we spend our $13 billion? Now, a lot of money doesn't shift in those 15 meetings. We dabble at the margins, partly because most of it can't shift. We provide 30,000 odd, I think it is, childcare subsidies. We should be providing 60. We're providing 30. We edge that up, but I think the number is every 200 costs another 0.5% on property taxes. So it's difficult to edge it up that quickly. But the way that you get in the budget is typically through a staff report or some kind of strategy. Our poverty reduction strategy, our housing now strategy. The city's got like 100 billion strategies. And to Pamela's point, I think I heard a little bit of Ken Richard in the background saying we've consulted enough, we've talked enough, we've done our job, you go do yours. And so we need to find a way through this. And I don't have an answer. I just have a little bit of advice for what it's worth. We need to find a way to get whatever recommendations come from either the report that was prepared, which was incredibly good and honest, I think, on personal perspectives about how the city is doing well and how it's not doing well. I think it's very, very well compiled. We have to somehow get to the budget process of the city if we want to fundamentally get some of these elements changed. Now, there is about an access to decision-making piece that is a very distinct point. But one of the problem, well, I don't want to frame it as a problem. One of the challenges is that the city staff that are sitting in here during the budget time answering questions are doing so also under the direction from the city manager saying you have to fit all additional new spending within your funding envelope. Don't expect any new money. And it takes an effort from the outside or one of these strategies to get new funding and enhanced services, enhanced funding on the table at budget. And so I wouldn't want to put this entirely in the hands of staff to do the plan, but if there was a report back, and I know other municipalities with respect to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, that they have an annual report back on their progress. And so it's not a distinct office, and I think that my mind is trying to figure out how that might work in relation to the city staff's budget ask. But I think it's a good idea, partly because sometimes city staff are so vested in in advancing reports and the programs that they work on, that they're not as ambitious as they could be in their financial ask. And they have a reporting structure to the city manager. So I think involving the community in how we evaluate our progress on an annual or a regular basis that can then feed directly into the budget process, which starts in, I think it starts in May, June, July, that time frame when staff start compiling budgets, but feeds the recommendations about how we can do better as a city on an annual basis into the budget process some way. It's not something that many divisions do terribly well, but if we can crack that code by getting advice from this committee, advice from community, advice from staff, all funneled into that process, that annual evaluation might actually result in an annual change in the way that we're providing resources. I don't know if that made any sense. You can catch me a day I don't have a cold, and I might be able to interpret that a little bit differently. But I think that we need to figure out a way so that it's not just staff doing the advocacy. The way we got the Indigenous Affairs Office, many of you know, took years of asking, took a couple sit-downs with the mayor's office, and eventually we got there. We need to start being able to do it quicker and move on this. And in particular to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action and the calls to justice here, I think if we can just make sure that our recommendations, the communities, their recommendations and advice somehow get funneled into the budget process more effectively, I think that we could really come up with something good, but some kind of report back to this committee that involves community and their perspective. What are we hearing from these agencies? Because not many come out to, most of them are on the committee, not many of them come out to depute. And to be honest, I want someone to be critical about what we're doing and tell us how we can do better. Because staff aren't always in that position, nor should they be necessarily giving political advice to politicians. But we need to hear from those voices at the budget time. So figuring out how to bring those boats into the dock at the same time would be helpful.
Thank you, Councillor.
Oh, I had a motion.
Oh, you did?
We were at questions, but we're at questions.
We're at questions. I have one comment, and then if there's no more questions, we can go to that motion. I mean, I appreciate your commentary. I do think that our recommendations need to be folded into the budget process. I also think that as we reflect on the new Indigenous Affairs Office, it's probably important for us to do some benchmarking across Canada, because other municipalities that have had offices for a longer time have set up different structures of governance and decision-making that enable those offices to more effectively be involved in the budgeting process. Vancouver, for example, has a reconciliation plan that folks are required to report out on quarterly, where a group like this is actually sitting with council and the mayor to talk about where we're at. And so I do think that next committee we should probably have a discussion about governance and think about who from the city we would like to involve in that discussion, because part of this process is going to require us to sort of challenge some of those structures that require so much bureaucratic engagement that's really not of or reflective of Indigenous worldview or values. So why don't we think about how we can shape some of that through the reconciliation that's inherent in this committee? That's my only commentary. Do we have any other questions or comments before we move to a motion? I think, Andrea, you said it all. Thank you.
So, and thank you for indulging me. I would have loved to figure out a way to craft this request to staff to determine how a independent office would weigh or judge us. I didn't see that. All I saw was this letter from TASC. So there is a recommendation in TASC from TASC around Council Fire and members of TASC partnership for the, let me just get this right, around an Indigenous community-led pilot project to address community safety, harm reduction, conflict and crisis response and peacekeeping. So I did write direction to staff to consider this with various divisions. I didn't say for inclusion in the next report that's coming, but I think it would be very, very useful if it could just be rolled into that. So this is just the recommendation from this report to ask that staff pay particular attention to it in the review process.
Perfect. So we've got the motion up on the screen. Want me to read that? It's here, yeah? Okay. So this is a motion that the Aboriginal Affairs Committee recommends that City Council request the Director, Indigenous Affairs Office, in consultation with the Medical Officer of Health and the Executive Director, Social Development, Finance, and Administration, to report to the appropriate committee on the implementation of a joint Toronto Aboriginal Support Services Council and Toronto Council Fire Native Cultural Centre Indigenous Community-Led Pilot Project to address community safety, harm reduction, conflict and crisis response, and peacekeeping from an Indigenous-led perspective, as outlined in Communication AA 3.3.1. That is a mouthful, well crafted. How do we feel? Are there any speakers on this item before we put it on the floor? Andrea?
Not a speaker. I just want to make sure that we're incorporating the additional call that I asked for further. I don't have a problem with this, but we need to enhance it further. You've got on your table the motion.
You want to add this as an additional communication material to this? Okay, one second.
So on a point of order, so probably the easiest way, just because this is the first time seeing it for the first time, but if I heard correctly from staff, the next meeting to see how one would include some kind of calls to justice office.
Right.
They might need more than a month and a half to consider it, but if we could refer it for staff in consideration to the report back, I'm happy doing the same for what I wrote here. That would just be the quickest way. Otherwise, clerks would probably have to spend some time just working this into a motion for our own, the way that the city needs to have its motions written.
Is that satisfactory? Do other members of the committee?
Now.
I'm just saying it would take, we could sit down and try to work through the language here. We might need a 20-minute recess.
That's good.
Do you want to move on to the next item and then revisit this motion? Can we do that?
Okay.
Yeah, so let's hold this item. But while we're doing that, can I have a motion to receive the item? No? No? Oh, we're not going to receive it, guys. Fair enough. Okay, we're going to hold this item and move on. Yeah. Thank you, too, very, very much. Okay, while we get that sorted, we're going to move on to the fourth item of our agenda for the day, AA 3.4, Indigenous-Newcomer Relations in Toronto. We have a joint presentation from Vera Dodick, the manager of the Toronto Newcomers Office in Social Development, Finance and Administration here at the city, along with Muna Gay, a community development officer in the Toronto Newcomer Office, again with Social Development, Finance and Administration. Just like to welcome you both to the committee. We look forward to your presentation. We'll just give them a moment to get set up.
Can we go to the first slide? Here's the connector.
So then,
How do I get it from the start?
you just go to select one second. There. So then we just go to this theory. Yes.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Vera Dodic, and I manage the City of Toronto's Newcomer Office. And with me here is Muna Gaye, who is one of my staff and the community development officer on my team that's responsible for developing our work related to Indigenous-Newcomer relations. We are very happy to be here with you today, and we made a similar presentation a couple of weeks ago to TASK, so I hope that today we will broaden the information that we will provide and get your input about the work that we are planning on doing. Just to provide first some background about the Newcomer Office, we were established in 2013, right after the City Council approved the Toronto Newcomer Strategy. In a way, we influenced the formation of the Indigenous Affairs Office because we had a couple of years of work that we invested in developing our approach and how we work with our partners. Initially, all of our funding came from the federal government, from the Citizenship and Immigration Canada at the time, and we were tasked with facilitating the implementation of the Newcomer Strategy. Over time, over the next couple of years, our mandate expanded to include the implementation of the Integrating Cities Charter, implementation of the Refugee Resettlement Program, implementation of the Access to City Services by Undocumented Torontonians, or Access TO program, and also more recently in 2019, our work included the implementation of the city's refugee capacity plan. So as the Indigenous Affairs Office, we have a significant mandate, significant scope of work. Our funding from 100% being funded by the federal government now includes a small amount of funding from the City of Toronto, just a bit higher than $100,000 a year. Every year, as you may know, the City of Toronto receives a significant number of newcomers that arrive here to and make Toronto their new home. More than 100,000 newcomers come to Toronto every year, and this includes between 60 and 80,000 new permanent residents, more than 20,000 refugees and refugee claimants, and thousands of international students and other temporary residents who ultimately stay in Toronto and are able to acquire a permanent residency. There are in total more than 500,000 Torontonians who can be called newcomers, who have arrived to our city in the last 5 years, so more than 500,000. More than half of our residents are immigrants, myself and Muna included. In addition to this, to add to the complexity of the scope here, there are some 200 agencies in Toronto that are funded to specifically provide services to newcomers and only to newcomers, so more than 200 community agencies. The City of Toronto works very closely with agencies and with these agencies and many other stakeholders, many other agencies that are providing services to Torontonians and are also supporting newcomers to Toronto. The Newcomer Office does not provide direct services similarly to the Indigenous Affairs Office, but we work at the strategic level and we focus on systemic issues. One of such issues relates to newcomer-Indigenous relations. Most newcomers uproot themselves in search of a better life, better opportunities, leaving their extended families, their homes, places where they were born, and they choose Canada as their new home, as one of the most welcoming countries to newcomers around the globe. But there is a significant gap as far as how much information is available to newcomers before they leave and after they arrive to Canada. about Indigenous peoples and about their history and about their treatment in Canada's history throughout the time. Because of that, to address this gap, the Newcomer Office has partnered with the Indigenous Affairs Office and OCASI, Ontario Coalition of Agencies Serving Immigrants, in hope to work towards addressing this gap. As you can see on this slide, the Truth and Reconciliation's calls to action number 93 and number 94 address and speak to the gap that I just mentioned. Newcomers are often disadvantaged when it comes to learning about the First Peoples due to language barriers, due to their limited resources and limited information that's available currently to them, and we are hoping to address this gap. Muna will share with you now about how we are planning to address this gap.
Okay, thank you, Vera. As Vera said, my name is Muna. I am a Community Development Officer with the Toronto Newcomer Office. Vera has touched on a bit about who we are and why we want to sort of engage in this work in strengthening Indigenous-Newcomer relationships. I want to first touch on a few things to mention that immigrants as well as Indigenous communities are currently the two fastest growing populations across the country and specifically in the city of Toronto. Vera has already mentioned that the newcomers are generally underinformed or misinformed about Indigenous histories, cultures, and perspectives, and we want to be able to sort of respond to this gap. Before we embarked on the work, we wanted to speak with other municipalities and establishments such as ours who have done similar work across the country. So we conducted what we would call a national scan. So we went across the country, we spoke to other municipalities, we spoke to establishments called local immigration partnerships across the country to see what have they been doing or what are they planning to do when it comes to strengthening newcomer Indigenous relations. And we started in the province of British Columbia, who's pretty much leading the pack in terms of response and large-scale initiatives that bring the two communities together, but more importantly, that educate newcomers around Indigenous histories, cultures, and perspectives. So back in 2011, the City of Vancouver, and that office is now the Vancouver Immigration Partnership, embarked on a project called the Vancouver Dialogues Project. This was a 2-year initiative that brought together newcomers and immigrants and Indigenous peoples in conversation with the main objective of relationship building. So over 2 years, relationships were built on the individual level, at the agency, sort of partnership and community level. The initiative was so impactful. However, one of the things that came out of it was that during the process, it was noticed that newcomers didn't have the basic information and knowledge around Indigenous history, cultures, and perspectives, so they needed to have some sort of resource that helped fill that gap. And out of that project came the First Peoples, a guide for newcomers, which was at the tail end of the Vancouver Dialogues Project. This guide is about 80 pages that focuses on some historical content, but also talks about the local First Nations communities in the Vancouver area, and then also touches on several teachings and also focuses on some of the conversations and relationships that happened during the Dialogues Project. I have to kind of take a step back to say that a lot of these projects and initiatives that I'm going to be mentioning were either Indigenous-led or co-created with municipal or community partners along with Indigenous partners. For the Vancouver Dialogues Project and the First Peoples Guide, the work was led by an Indigenous scholar in the Vancouver area. This same scholar was then contracted by another settlement or immigrant serving agency in the Vancouver area to develop a video that's called Welcome to Our Homelands. And this video was created by the local First Nations communities in the Vancouver area, welcoming newcomers to the lands, and it was done in the various First Nations languages and then translated for the target audience. Along with it, to help those who work with newcomers better be able to sort of disseminate the information, a study guide was also created to accompany the video. So in the BC area, there's a lot of resources, a lot of initiatives ongoing, as well as relationships that have been built over a number of years. Then moving on, we look at the province of Manitoba, and their work has been very extensive, but also a little bit reactive in that it was prompted by already strained relationships that were happening between the two communities, especially amongst youth. So initially, the focus for the establishment, similar to ours in Vancouver, called the Immigration Partnership Winnipeg, decided to start an initiative looking at already existing programming that youth were engaged in, and took that as a platform to bring Indigenous youth and newcomer youth in conversation. Taking that a step forward, they wanted to have a number of tables, or working tables and advisory tables, that helped support and guide a long-term initiative to sort of build relationships between the two communities. So with this, they created 3 sector tables. So they had an Indigenous elders table, so representation from Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers in the Winnipeg area who provided guidance and advice for their work. And then they created an Indigenous-Newcomer youth table, again, getting the voices of youth to be able to add to the conversation. And finally, Indigenous-Newcomer technical sector table, so those staff who worked within the 2 sectors came together to also help. All this work culminated in a toolkit that they just released about a month ago that is advising community agencies, those who work with and for newcomers and refugees, those who teach newcomers and refugees, on how to engage and how to increase awareness and educate newcomers around Indigenous histories and cultures. And then very quickly, across the country in other provinces, so in Alberta, Nova Scotia, and Saskatchewan, there hasn't been anything larger scale, but they've really leveraged some of the work that's been done in other parts of the country. They're also leveraging the use of technology, looking at building relationships at the youth level, looking at sharing information around language, and also basically educating newcomers in these areas. In our own backyard in Ontario, again, we haven't engaged in anything large scale, but there are a number of community agencies here that have been doing a bit of work around educating, not specifically targeting newcomers, but more generally Toronto residents around Indigenous histories and perspectives. And one of them is the Toronto Green community that does Rivers Rising walking tour. Ryerson University has also had a niche program where they target international students to their campus, and they do a campus tour with a focus on placemaking and talk about how that relates to Indigenous history. And our office, over the last few years, on a very smaller scale, have partnered with a number of Indigenous agencies, Toronto Council Fire being one of them, when we host our annual Toronto Newcomer Day celebration each year. So a lot of the work we spent speaking to colleagues across the country led us to trying to come up with a plan for the Toronto context, which is what we wanted to share with you today. So seeing that a number of our counterparts had created a resource, we are looking to create a resource guide as well, with the main intention to educate newcomers, to limit stereotypes and misinformation, and to also have a longer-term goal of building relationships between the two communities. On top of that, we've noticed the importance of relationship building moving forward in the longer term, given that both of our communities are fast growing, that it is very important that we have those relationships be built at this point. So we're looking at facilitating dialogue circles or just opportunities to bring the two communities together in a goal of learning and sharing and getting to know each other. And then finally, for those of us who work with and for newcomers and refugees, we want to take some of the same content from the resource guide, but then create an online orientation tool for frontline workers in the settlement sector, for those of us who are also in the technical or professional realm, to learn about the same information and have the same opportunity, because oftentimes immigrants, the first sort of face they see is a settlement worker, and it'd be important if that same worker knew the information to be able to transfer that on to the newcomer. So that brings us to why we're here today. We wanted to be able to get some feedback from you about this plan that we are looking to work on in the spirit of co-creation, because as has been done in all of the other communities across the country, that the work has always been either Indigenous-led or co-created. So we're here today seeking support from the Indigenous community, the community agencies, elders, and knowledge keepers to get your sort of feedback on whether work similar to this is already being done that we can leverage as opposed to reinventing the wheel and starting from scratch. And if it's not being done, is there any recommendation as to who we can engage to lead or co-create the work? And then finally, one of our first next steps, once we have sort of identified the key pieces we're going to move forward with, is the creation of a newcomer Indigenous advisory table to help guide the initiative as it moves along. And we're looking for your participation and engagement, hopefully representation from folks at this committee, at that advisory table. And finally, nothing can be achieved without an open dialogue. We realize we're presenting this to you now, and this is not going to be, there's not enough time for you to really think through this and give us feedback. So we're looking at hosting an open dialogue, bringing together members of the immigrant and refugee serving community and Indigenous community partners in conversation to talk more in depth about this initiative. So that event we're currently planning in partnership with the Indigenous Affairs Office in Okasi on February 20th at the 519 Grand Ballroom on Church Street from 9 a.m. to 12:30. One of the three main objectives we're wanting to achieve beyond just getting feedback about the plan is we want to find out what is already going on between our two communities. There might be already smaller scale work happening at the local level that we're not aware of, that we want to be able to map and see how we can leverage those initiatives that are already ongoing, as well as their partnerships already that have been built or in the process of being built that we can leverage as well. And as a community, more specifically for those of us in the immigrant and refugee serving community, we want to think around what our sort of collaborative approach is to advancing reconciliation, and more specifically the calls to action 93 and 94 and how we can contribute to that work. So we're hoping that you can attend the event. We can share, again, the invitation to members of the group if it's possible. But again, it's February 20th at the 519 Ballroom in the morning, a half-day session. Thanks. And that is it from us. Thank you.
Many thanks to both of you for that presentation. I'd just like to open things up to the floor and ask if there's any speakers to the item or any questions or comments from the committee. Angus.
Yeah, I just want to say that I think that this is a really, really fine initiative. I think that the idea of establishing a newcomer and Indigenous table is a very positive one. I speak as the general manager of Wigwaman, which is an Indigenous housing provider, but which also has a number of buildings which have populations which are mixed. So I think of 20 Sewells Road, which was developed with a mandate where half of the units are filled with Indigenous families and half are taken off the Housing Connections waiting list. And if you take a look at the Housing Connections waiting list, those tens of thousands of people, tens of thousands of them are newcomers. And I reflect on the history and the development of Sewells Road, which is a terrific community. It's a very, very strong community. And I just think about the benefits that the Indigenous families that live there have come to gain from living in the same building with newcomers, and vice versa. It's a neat thing when people come together to build. And I also think that I mean there's different ways of looking at this, but immigration is a fact, and I think that there is a powerful symmetry when you bring together this country's first peoples and the immigrants who are making this country their home today. So I would say that certainly if you reach out to Wigwaman, I think that we might well have an interest in participating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Angus. Tanya?
I also concur that this is a great initiative with the path of reconciliation and restitution with newcomers having that understanding, that educational foundation in which to better the relationship in Canada as it continues to change in Indigenous Canadian relations. I am hearing that the focus would be on history perspectives and cultures, et cetera. And just to articulate it, and I'm sure that this is a part of the perspectives piece, that there is also a focus on contemporary realities and current contexts, because often with resources, you may find Indigenous peoples positioned in the past and rendered invisible. And so it's important to have that key piece that Indigenous communities across Canada are very vibrant.
Thank you.
Thank you. Further questions or comments? Andrea?
I want to add my comments and thank you both for your presentation, and to let you know that we've been working. Regent Park is a very multicultural space, and our relationship are really critical, and not just to stand with our community, because crime, homelessness, and food sovereignty and insecurity is really critical for all of us. So that I want to say that first. One of the things that Toronto Council Fire is taking a lead on is the installation that you are familiar with. In 2022, it's now called the Spirit Garden, and it'll be the teaching, learning, sharing, healing space. And we are currently working with John Ralston Saul, the Institute for Canadian Citizenship. This particular year, during our event, September 17th and 18th, we will be building into our program the ability of doing that proper recognition and acknowledgement of people into our space, right? And I think it's really important that those things happen. In developing the teaching, learning, sharing, healing space, will be shared as a shared learning process for anyone, for anyone and everyone, that we're looking to have knowledge keepers, people of the different places to utilize that space, whether Anishinaabe, Ongwahongwe, Cree, Lenape, Métis, or Inuit. And that's the whole intent, because our teachings say something really different. Our teaching tells us as Ongwahongwe that we come from Sky World, and we too are newcomers on this turtle. And so it's really important for us to reach out and to ensure that we're sharing our stories with you. And I guess the biggest thing is so we can address all of those impacts, the negative impacts, by love, respect, of one another, and forging and bringing our heads together for solutions as opposed to conflict. So I look forward to it. I think this might be our third year we'll be working with the newcomers, and we learn just as well. We learn just as well from the engagement of the individuals that we have, and many of our families are intermixed, and it's really important that we acknowledge that and honor that, and not and that it becomes a really critical place in the land that we all are part. As long as we're responsible, and kind to our mother, and that we too take on the concepts of support and love. Council Fire would very much like to be a part of that advisory table, but we will be in attendance for the February 20th too as well. So yeah, won't go. No.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think I've mentioned it before, but I'm wearing a couple hats today. I'm also the Executive Director of Native Child and Family Services of Toronto, and we see, the same thing that Angus commented. If you go to our Scarborough location, there's many mixed families, and so we certainly have, I think this is important work, and we certainly have an interest in being involved and moving it forward as best we can. So miigwech for bringing this to the table. Yeah. Any other comments from the committee? Mr. Frost.
Yeah, I too want to thank both of you for your presentation. Why I like it, you'll often hear me say the word unity, It's about 10. We all work together as one to make this a very, very comfortable, safe, and happy world we live in. So, miigwech, thank you very much.
Okay, if we don't have any other further comments, then I just need a motion on the floor to receive the item. Got a motion from Angus. He's quick fingers over there, Angus. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. Miigwech. Okay, so we're just going to, before proceeding to the fifth item, we are just going to return to item A 3.3. I believe we have two motions on the floor. Okay, this first motion is moved by Councillor Layton, I believe. So we have two motions. The first one here is moved by Councillor Layton. I'll just give you guys a moment to read it. It's the same one as before. All in favor? Any opposed? Seeing none, the motion carries. Miigwech. So the second motion, put on the floor by Andrea. It's new to our eyes, so I'll read it quickly. City Council requests the Director, Indigenous Affairs Office, in consultation with appropriate City of Toronto staff, to report to the appropriate committee on the establishment of a permanent City of Toronto Calls to Justice office, as outlined in Communication AA 3.3.2. All in favor? Any opposed? Seeing none, the motion is carried. Miigwech. I believe I also need an item, a motion just to receive. No? No? Okay, we're good then. Great. We can then move on to the fifth and final item on our agenda this afternoon. It is now the afternoon, folks. The fifth item is item AA 2.5, revised 2020 schedule of the Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee. I believe the revised dates have been circulated to committee members. And just as a matter of procedure, I wanted to put this item on the floor and ask if there's any speakers to this item. How are we feeling about the proposed new dates and increased frequency of meetings? Councillor Layton.
So I hate to do this and to think very selfishly about what I'll be doing at the end of August. But I believe that the second last week of August might be a tough time to get quorum. I certainly have a family camping trip planned for around about that week. I don't know if other people would struggle the same way. I do, though, have a solution that there's the week of September 8th to 11th is actually a week that typically, it's the FCM board meeting is a week that we typically don't schedule any committee meetings at the city. So it's absolutely empty for meetings. So I would just say it might be an appropriate time. Puts us pretty close to the October meeting. I wouldn't suggest we change them. We're going to have a lot of stuff to talk about. I just wouldn't want us to not have quorum and some people take a beautiful Wednesday, August the 26th to come down here when they don't. And I'm sure staff might also be thinking the same way. I'm not sure. It might be a difficult week to get quorum, just saying.
So we did, so the city clerks did reach out to all members to poll everyone with these specific dates, and we do in fact have quorum for all of these dates. Yeah, yeah. More than 8. So, though, I mean, of course, certain members aren't able to attend meetings. They're deeply missed, but yeah. Any other commentary about these proposed new dates? Okay. Can I then have a motion on the floor to, do we need a motion? To receive the item? Andrea? All in favor? Any opposed? Seeing none, the motion is carried. Okay, members, I would like to move a motion to excuse the absences of committee members who are not in attendance for the meeting today. Can the clerk display the motion on the screen? Is there any further discussion? I'll give you a moment to read it. Any- Okay. All those in favor? Do I need a mover? I moved it, guys. All in favor? Any opposed? No one's at the spot this time, Mike. Good. Okay, seeing none, the motion carries. Thank you. Thank you for taking time to attend today's meeting. This concludes our business for today. The meeting is now adjourned. Team Miigwech to all of you. Thank you.